No empire in history collapsed because of war. They collapse when they run out of money. The British Empire won World War II. Tanks rolled back, flags waved in victory. But just 1 year later, the same empire had to borrow $3.75 billion from the United States. The loan came with strings so sharp, it quietly dismantled the largest empire the world had ever seen. Not with bullets, not with treaties, but with a balance sheet. In 1946, under the British Loan Act, the United Kingdom borrowed $3.75 billion, a lifeline that looked like salvation. But buried in the fine print were terms that stripped Britain of its control over trade, currency, and global assets. One condition: the pound sterling must become freely convertible into US dollars. Another: the empire must dismantle its preferential trade networks and open up to American goods. 6 weeks later, the pound collapsed by 30%. Investors fled. Reserves evaporated. And the empire, once powered by gold and colonies, found itself leveraged and losing. What followed wasn't defeat. It was liquidation. They didn't lose the empire. They pawned it for liquidity. What looked like a bailout was something colder, a buyout. And for a few $billion, barely a rounding error in today's markets, the United States became not just a creditor, but the new architect of global power. So how do you win a war and lose your empire? If empires can be sold off this quietly, what about democracies? To understand how this happened, we have to follow the money. Because history doesn't lie, but balance sheets never forget. Britain won the war. But victory came with a price tag the empire couldn't afford. From 1939 to 1945, the United Kingdom spent more than £25 billion, an amount that would be worth over $1 trillion today. To fund the war machine, they sold off gold, foreign investments, and liquidated reserves accumulated over centuries. National debt tripled in 6 years. By 1945, the empire's pockets were empty and its assets were already gone. London had to sell off its holdings in Canada, India, and even the United States just to stay solvent. Victory didn't feel like triumph, it felt like overdraft. In theory, Britain stood tall among the winners. In practice, it was now the largest debtor nation in the Western Alliance. It had tanks but no treasury, flags but no reserves, a navy but no liquidity. The war had been won on credit. Credit extended by American banks, leveraged against colonial assets, and paid for with a currency that was already bleeding value. And as the guns fell silent, the invoices arrived. Military glory couldn't hide the financial wreckage underneath. Which raises a brutal question. If winning a war means losing your currency, your assets, and eventually your empire, then what exactly did Britain win? This is not just a paradox, it's a prelude. Because the fall of empires rarely begins with defeat, it begins with debt. And for Britain, the war wasn't just the end of one era, it was the beginning of foreclosure. But the real story of liquidation didn't start with surrender. It started with an invoice and a policy called cash and carry. Before the fall, there was illusion. The British Empire didn't just conquer land, it conquered credit. For nearly a century, the pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. London wasn't just the political capital of an empire, it was the financial capital of the world. By the early 20th century, Britain held over 50% of all foreign investments globally, from the tea fields of India to the oil wells of Persia, from African mines to Malayan rubber plantations. Every corner of the map paid dividends to the crown. This was the empire's true engine, not armies, but annuities, not soldiers, but shipping insurance. The colonies sent raw materials and the profits flowed back through City of London banks. British companies didn't just trade, they owned, not just assets, but infrastructure. And the pound sat at the center, strong, stable, unquestioned. But underneath that facade, the system was brittle. Britain was deeply dependent on imports for industrial strength. It didn't produce all it needed, it leveraged what others produced. The empire was a cash flow machine, not a stockpile. When global trade was humming, the system thrived. But when war choked the flow of rubber, oil, metals, manpower, supply chains snapped, and so did the margins. This was a global company structured like a hedge fund, highly leveraged, heavily exposed. And as bombs fell over Europe, the invoices piled up. The truth was simple and dangerous. Britain didn't have the reserves to survive a long war. Its empire wasn't backed by hard power, but by soft liquidity. And when the markets froze, the empire's balance sheet unraveled. The question wasn't if collapse would come, but what price it would fetch, and that price would be extracted, one invoice at a time. The first came under the name of a policy called cash and carry. The bleeding didn't start with bombs, it started with policy. In 1939, the United States passed the Cash and Carry Act. The message was clear. We'll sell you weapons, but only if you pay in full. No credit, no favors, just cash or gold. For Britain, it was a slow-motion foreclosure. To keep its armies moving, it had to drain its vaults. Gold reserves in New York were sold off, ounce by ounce. Strategic stakes in companies were liquidated. American Viscose, Canadian Pacific, British Petroleum shares. Real assets were exchanged for bullets that wouldn't return. This wasn't trade, it was triage. Britain became a distressed seller, auctioning off the empire's family silver to buy time. The U.S. didn't invade the empire. It invoiced it, and every invoice came with interest. Between 1939 and 1941, over $1.3 billion worth of British-owned assets flowed into American hands. Factories, railroads, mining rights, infrastructure, built over generations, surrendered for tanks that would be scrapped in months. Britain wasn't importing security, it was exporting sovereignty. Economists called it wartime liquidity, but on a balance sheet, it looked like desperation. The empire resembled a corporation burning fixed assets to maintain operations. No long-term capital plan, no reinvestment, just survival. Britain was trading castles for cartridges, and the longer the war dragged on, the more castles disappeared. This was not aid, it was leverage, and America wasn't done. Cash and carry was just phase 1. Phase 2 would offer help, but with a hook buried deep. That hook was called Lend-Lease. In 1941, Washington unveiled its masterstroke, Lend-Lease, marketed as generosity, hailed as alliance. Over $31 billion in aid would flow from America to Britain, but the fine print told another story. This wasn't charity, it was collateralized control. To qualify, Britain had to open its books, completely. The U.S. demanded full transparency on the empire's budget, reserves, assets, and offshore holdings. Every colonial bank, every shipping company, every profitable subsidiary, exposed. Worse, London had to sell off stakes in American firms it had built over decades. The American Viscose Company, gone. Profitable shipping lines, transferred. Revenues that once funded British railways and schools rerouted into Wall Street portfolios, and for every crate of weapons, Washington asked for something more permanent. Military bases, 99-year leases. From the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, American flags began to replace British ones, not with gunfire, but with contracts. The map was changing without a single battlefield. This wasn't foreign aid, it was financial foreclosure. The United States wasn't helping Britain win. It was helping Britain shrink. And in doing so, Washington was drafting a new post-war map, with America at the center. Britain accepted it all, because it had no choice. The illusion of aid masked a quiet transfer of empire, territory by territory, asset by asset, power by power. The empire was still flying the Union Jack, but the deed was being rewritten, not with war, but with ledgers, and the real demolition hadn't even begun. That would come with Article 7, the clause no empire could survive. Buried deep inside the Lend-Lease agreement was a clause so surgical it didn't need bombs to destroy an empire. Article 7. On the surface, it sounded reasonable. Post-war economic cooperation. But in practice, it was a trapdoor. Britain was forced to abandon the imperial preference system, the very backbone of its global trade network. For over a century, British colonies had traded primarily within the empire, bound by tariff protections that kept London at the center. Article 6 tore that apart. It mandated that after the war, Britain must open its markets, entirely, to American goods. No more tariffs, no more protected industrial zones, no more economic moat. The empire's internal trade routes collapsed, overnight. Former colonies shifted their loyalty, not through rebellion, but through receipts. American imports flooded their markets, outpricing British manufacturers weakened by war. In London, factories that had once armed the world stood silent, unable to compete with cheaper, mass-produced American exports. The empire's industrial engine didn't break down. It was outbid. And the most chilling part? This collapse came not in conflict, but in compliance. A peaceful surrender, signed in the language of global trade. A WTO prototype drafted before the WTO existed. Britain had won the war, but it had signed away the terms of peace. With Article 7, the demolition of the British Empire became legally binding, not with force, with ink. And just when the dust began to settle, the final blow landed in the form of a loan. A loan that would trigger a collapse in weeks and ripple for decades. Victory had barely been declared when the generosity ended. In August 1945, the United States abruptly terminated the Lend-Lease program. No warning, no grace period. Britain, still bleeding from 6 years of war, was left financially exposed. To survive, it turned to Washington again. The result was the 1946 Anglo-American Loan Agreement, a $3.75 billion package, the largest sovereign loan in history at the time. But the money came with conditions, ones that guaranteed collapse. Chief among them, sterling convertibility. Britain was required to make the pound fully exchangeable into US dollars. That meant anyone holding pounds, foreign governments, private investors, former colonies, could demand payment in dollars at a fixed rate. There was no cap, no delay, no safety valve. In just 6 weeks, the Bank of England's reserves were drained by a tidal wave of redemptions. The dollar was strong, the pound was wounded, and everyone knew it. Markets smelled blood. In July 1947, Britain was forced to abandon convertibility. Then came the inevitable, a 30% devaluation of the pound. It was a financial humiliation, engineered by design. The United States didn't impose austerity, it simply let gravity do the job. By forcing Britain to open its capital account prematurely, the U.S. triggered a silent run on the pound. No military occupation, no coup, just policy, just timing. And in the ledger books of history, this is the page where the British Empire's obituary was written, in numbers, not words. This wasn't a bailout, it was a buyout. And behind every collapse, there's always a line item labeled final payment. But empires don't end in balance sheets alone. Their legacy lives on, in the systems they leave behind. Empires fall, but their playbooks rarely die. After Britain collapsed under the weight of financial dependency, the system that undid it was refined, not discarded, and it was adopted by its successor. In 1944, even before the war had ended, the blueprint was being drafted. At Bretton Woods, the United States led the creation of a new global institution, the International Monetary Fund. Publicly, it promised stability. Quietly, it embedded the very model that had dismantled the British Empire. The logic was elegant in its simplicity. Lend money to struggling nations, but tie every dollar to a policy condition. Spending cuts, market liberalization, currency devaluation. These weren't suggestions. They were structural adjustment programs, an economic straitjacket disguised as help. The language softened, but the tools sharpened. No troops, no gunboats, just debt and default triggers. By the 1980s, the IMF was everywhere, in Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and the story repeated. Sovereign crises met with loans, followed by concessions, followed by foreign access to domestic markets. Economic sovereignty traded for liquidity. It was Lend-Lease 2.0, this time globalized. The result? The United States became the world's creditor-in-chief, and every financial crisis became an opportunity to shape another country's economic policies without ever raising a flag. But here's the irony. Britain lost its empire in exchange for a loan, yet the imperial mechanism it succumbed to lived on. It survived, and it scaled. Today the empire is gone, but its collapse wasn't a warning. It was a prototype. And the lesson? Control the terms, and you don't need to conquer. You just need signatures. But when signatures replace sovereignty, what comes next? No tanks, no coups, no gunfire, just paperwork, a loan, a signature. That's how the greatest empire on earth vanished, not in battle, but in balance sheets. Britain didn't fall, it defaulted. America didn't invade, it acquired, piece by piece, through liquidity, not force. The transfer of power wasn't announced, it was invoiced. Today that same architecture still stands. IMF, World Bank, central banks with global reach, no flags, just maturities, no soldiers, just interest rates. And the message is clear. You don't need to topple a government if you can schedule its collapse, because empires aren't destroyed anymore. They're refinanced. Britain taught America how to rule the world. America just switched the currency. And if that sounds distant, ask yourself, if an empire can collapse from the loss of monetary control, what happens to democracies, to markets, to your savings? When the next financial rupture hits, will your nation be holding the pen or signing the deal? Because history doesn't echo in speeches, it echoes in debt.